Hi guys, welcome to Those Two Chicks with a Podcast. I'm Jordan.
And I'm Emma Grace. This is part 2 of our Richard Hitchcock case. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I highly recommend you go listen to that episode first before you continue with this episode.
We said this in the last episode, but we would like to mention that before we start, we will talk about what we know to be facts and what was reported, but all theories are alleged and we can't confirm them as true. This is a touchy subject as this is the town we are from, but we will be mentioning names of persons of interest, but again, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Our goal is to present his case the best we can to bring awareness. We don't think this podcast will solve his case, but we do think that getting the conversation going again could help.
In the first episode, we went over a few different theories as to what may have happened that day. And seriously, there are a ton. We couldn't possibly add them all in due to the sheer amount, but also the lack of evidence. We know that although these rumors could be considered entertaining for a true crime podcast, there's absolutely no backing, and we want to help find out what really did happen that night.
So we decided to bring you the theories with the most backing. Now, in this episode, we will go over these theories one more time, but with a member of the Allegan City Police Department, Officer Luyk. Can you start by telling us a little about yourself? Are you from Allegan, or, what brought you here if you're not?
Yep. I was born and raised in Allegan. Spent most of my life there. I graduated Allegan High School in 1990, went into the Marine Corps, did 4 years there, and that I left for California, ran out. I ended up coming back home. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do after the Marines, so I ended up doing some factory work for a few years, and then this opportunity opened up with the police department, and I was able to get on Allegan PD and have really enjoyed my time there since.
When we think of police work in a small town, you worry that there may be a bias due to everyone knowing everything about everyone else. But that wasn't the case for Matt. He told us he kept to himself and really had no opinion of the case when he was assigned years later.
Were you pretty close in age with Richie? Did you know him?
I did not know him personally. He, I think, would have been about 2 years older than me. It was one of the things that, I was aware of before being on the police department, but I was just separated enough that, I didn't really keep up. I didn't know a lot of the names of the people that I would later talk to during the investigations before joining the police department.
So how long have you been on the police force then?
I've been on for just over 16 years now.
If you remember from part 1, we mentioned that the most common theory or story that was told about Richie's disappearance. It was said that Richie ended up in the Kalamazoo River behind the Riverfront Lounge, the bar he was kicked out of that night. If you're a local, you know that this is nearly impossible. It's so heavy with trees and landscape that you would have to do some serious maneuvers to get down there. Add in the fact that this is Michigan in the winter, why weren't there any footprints?
We started by asking Officer Luyk about the eyewitnesses' accounts from that night. He informed us that there were actually some credible witnesses who came forward years after Richie's disappearance.
That's something that's very unique to cold case investigations versus a case that you're dealing with real time. You're in some cases 2 or 3 years after the fact. In this one, it was 15 to 20 years later. The witnesses that we're talking to in that time, sometimes your memory of what you're recalling changes. You've talked to people enough times that were also present maybe who saw things a little different, and after 20 years of sharing stories, it might change your memory of exactly what you thought you saw at the time. The people we spoke to seemed very credible because they were so passionate about recalling what they saw that night. Everybody we spoke to was absolutely convinced this is what happened. So, in that scenario, the one where Richie went through the bar and out the back and over the fence into the river, the witnesses that shared that scenario seemed very credible. That was the part of the story was that he was being chased by a couple of individuals, and that's why he ran through.
We found this incredibly interesting. You've heard us mention the dense foliage behind the bar, and these people distinctly remember hearing Richie crash through it, breaking through the ice of the river. Could this be possible?
This possibility was actually new to our research as well. In part 1, we discussed that Richie could have been in trouble with some individuals. Could Richie have been running away from the people trying to hurt him, but he ended up falling down the embankment by accident?
Well, it could be. But Officer Luyk also told us that the authorities were absolutely positive that Richie was not in that river.
That was the decision at the time. They had the Allegan County Sheriff's Department dive team went out. They enlisted the help of the Michigan State Police dive team. And I don't know if there were any other just private volunteers, but I know after reading the report from both of those agencies, they felt confident at the time that if he had been in the river, they would have found him based on their search.
We then discussed the eyewitnesses who said they saw Richie Green and Bob Clark beating Richie in the parking lot.
There was an eyewitness who saw Bob Clark and Richie Green, as she put it, putting the boots to Richard. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that? Is that possibly a rumor, or have you guys gotten reports of that?
Mm-hmm. And again, I will say that because it is still an open investigation, I can't comment specifically on names of individuals because it is an open and ongoing investigation.
Okay.
But there have been several reports that individuals in and around Allegan had something going with Richie. And the main theory was that it was drug related, that he might have somehow gotten messed up with the wrong people, did suffer a severe beating. Multiple theories on, if that were true, where he may have been buried or what may have been done with the body, if that was the case.
For those of you not local to Allegan, we want to tell you a little bit about the town because the possibility of drug violence just seems almost movie-like to have been happening here.
In 1990, Allegan only had around 4,500 residents. The chance of a non-violent crime occurring to you in Allegan is 74% lower than the national average.
Your chance of a violent crime occurring to you in Allegan is 38% lower than the national average, and that's the current rate. Imagine over 30 years ago when the town was even smaller.
You can count the number of murders that have occurred in Allegan, Michigan during the past 100 years literally on one hand. So we asked Officer Matt Luyk what he thought about the possibility of drug violence in Allegan.
It's tough because, again, at that time, I would have been 18, 19 years old.
Right.
And I'll be honest with you, I led a very sheltered life then. I mean, my parents were very protective. And
yeah.
I really was not aware of what was going on in the city even back then. And during this specific time, I had been out in California. So, I mean, this is 30 years ago. Marijuana was kind of not a big deal then, but, I don't think we had seen much other than that coming in at that point, that, marijuana could have been a big enough deal that kind of money or those kind of transactions could have potentially had some danger, but no, all in all, Allegan, even back then, was pretty much the same safe, quiet town that it is now. It's possible. Mm-hmm. I don't know how likely it would have been, but I mean, it's absolutely anywhere there's drugs and money that are exchanging hands, there's always the potential for violence.
If you remember in part 1, we talked about a few local men that ended up in Montana after Richie's death and their possible ties with the case. We discussed the possibility of their involvement with Officer Luyk as well. Here were his thoughts.
All that was as myself and the detective from the Sheriff's Department, in looking through our case files, we have to re-interview every single person that has ever been talked to. That's how the cold case worked.
Okay.
We sit down as a team and we take out his case file and we make a list of every single witness, suspect, anybody that had anything to do with this case ever. We make a list of those names and we start contacting them one after the next. In many cases, those people either one were, they'd give us names we'd never heard of before, or something new would come up. But the folks that were in Montana were actually Allegan people at one time during the time of this, and knew Richie, and had since moved to Montana and were running a business out there. And, if at all possible, we don't want to do these interviews over the phone. We want to be face to face. And so that's why we flew out there to do this interview with them, because we wanted to do a face to face interview. And I can tell you, there was nothing that came out of that interview that helped in any aspect of the case. So it wasn't a wasted trip by any means, because, we have learned over the years that it is always going to be that smallest little piece of information that somebody thought was so insignificant that is the one thing that starts unraveling all these tales and sometimes make the biggest impact on an investigation. So, it was absolutely worth it, but yeah, that was the only reason we went out to Montana, was just to do a face-to-face interview.
We did reach out to him again to ask about the suicide note Rick Thorpe left to the detective of Richie's case. His explanation was that, though this seems very odd, it was because the two had grown up together. They did have a troubled past, as Rick was often in trouble with the law, and the detective was usually the one dealing with it. The suicide letter was essentially just a way to let the detective know about Rick's passing. We still do find this coincidence odd, but we cannot confirm any involvement at this time.
We also asked Officer Luyk if Jack Mannon's ex-wife had told them anything about the possible location of Richie's remains.
So many locations given to us that, again, these folks are absolutely convinced and passionate that this is where he is, or this is what happened to him. And we have used every resource available. We've used, cadaver sniffing dogs. We've used ground penetrating radar or sonar, rented excavation equipment, and dug into concrete floors and walls, and have never been able to find any remains.
And that's actually perfect. It'll lead us to our next questions, because we wanted to talk about some of the properties you guys have searched. Could you tell us a little bit about the search that happened at, we believe it's Richie Green's ex-wife's property? I think it was her house where you guys dug up the concrete. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
What the scenarios that we were given was that he was out at this house. And again, there are different stories that he was beaten up downtown Allegan. And again, you have these folks are telling us these stories as if it just happened. And, they're like, oh, we saw this happen right in the middle of the street and get thrown into a car. There's other stories that he was at this house, with somebody, and it went down there, and that's how he ended up, in this location. And in this specific occasion, he was at that house, that something happened there, and that he was buried under the concrete in an addition. So during an investigation in the garage, we did find a pad of concrete that you could tell was newer than the rest of the floor. We did use one of those ground penetrating sonars and detected some sort of mass under the ground. So we spent a couple of days excavating and got down to where the mass was, and it ended up just being a large rock. But again, at the time or in years after, somebody remembers them pouring new concrete in there, and absolutely would make sense that somebody could put those, connect those dots and think that had to have been what happened to them. And just unfortunately, it did not pan out.
Let's not forget about the search of Bob Clark's property.
Was done actually before I was on the team, and my understanding is he was cooperative, and I believe he had a pole barn with a concrete floor, and that was another theory, was that he was under that floor. And my understanding was, he did allow them to come in, drill holes through the concrete, and that's when they brought in the cadaver sniffing dogs, and the dogs never indicated on anything under the floor.
So basically, we are back to where we started. every theory we were leaning towards, Officer Luyk can almost explain away, which is just so odd. What really happened to Richie? We asked if there was any forensic evidence that investigators found when Richie went missing.
Yep, the car had been processed by, evidence technicians at the time. Nothing suspicious found in or around it. It was parked in an area that he would have normally parked to go hang out downtown. Again, I didn't come into this until years later, but this happened a few days before Christmas. He had Christmas presents that he had purchased for his family in the vehicle, and nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. There was no damage to the vehicle, so nothing suspicious about the vehicle. So it's just whether it was something accidental or something more serious.
Do you think it's odd or that this case has gone unsolved for so long in such a small town?
I do. I really do. It's funny, especially with how social media has taken off. I mean, in a small town like this, everybody kind of knew everybody's business anyway.
Oh, yeah.
But so much information is shared, whether it's true or not, through social media every day. I find it so hard to comprehend how something this big, whether it was an accident or if it was something more serious, we don't have answers. I have a hard time comprehending that, because we have talked to so many people that were considered people of interest. And it really did come down to about 3 or 4 people that, no matter what the scenario, there were 3 or 4 people that were consistently named as the people of interest. All this time and resources put into this case, and to feel like you're no closer is just, it's hard to comprehend sometimes.
Do you think that the circulation of rumors slowed down the investigation?
I don't think it slows it down. It definitely pulls you in different directions that maybe aren't getting you closer to finding the answers. But without that, we definitely do get new names and new information. Not as much these days, because now after this many years, you've pretty much heard and seen everything. But the more something comes out, like I said, it is that one little nugget that after 30 years somebody might have been holding on to, thinking it was nothing. Right. And that's, again, we have found that in multiple cold case investigations, that somebody just, they never reported this because they thought, this isn't anything. And, just by luck or by chance, their name comes up through somebody else. We go knock on their door. I heard about this. And, this happened. And we're like, well, that's the first time we've heard of that. And sometimes it turns into something. Sometimes it doesn't. But so I feel like any kind of circulation is still good, because no matter what is coming out of it, you're always better off to have too much information than not enough.
So there was absolutely no evidence that the investigators at the time could find when he did go missing. Like, it was almost like he went missing without any traces. You don't think that there's any possibility that he just up and left for a new life?
We don't. Yeah, I can speak for the whole team on that. I mean, whatever happened, we believe, he is no longer living. I know it's possible to create a new identity, but at that time, it would have been much more difficult, and there were no financial transactions made from the day he went missing. Nothing happened with any of his bank account or anything like that, which just leads you to believe that whatever happened was very final.
I wanted to ask, and I don't mean any offense when I ask this question. What do you think about the people who say the police department could possibly be covering up what happened to Richie?
There's so many cases that is the case. I mean, I think a lot of people get frustrated. There are supporters of law enforcement, and there are people that are not. And there might even be supporters that get so frustrated that after this many years, we have nothing to show for it. Even somebody on the side of law enforcement could say, is that a possibility? Is that an option that they're covering something up?
Mm-hmm.
And all I can say is just from everything I read, I mean, he wasn't a troubled person. He wasn't somebody that had a lot of police contact. He was not somebody that law enforcement was looking for a reason to get rid of him.
Mm-hmm.
So, I can understand where people have to find something tangible to hold on to say, this is why we cannot find remains. We have no answers because there has to be a cover-up. I don't get offended by that stuff because I know at the end of the day, I'm doing everything I can for the family and for Richie to try and find those answers. And I understand the sense of loss, the emptiness some of these folks must feel not having any answers,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just human nature. You've got to find something to have it make sense.
What did Officer Luyk believe happened the night Richie went missing?
I honestly, I can't. Not because I feel like it's not appropriate to tell you, but I just go back and forth. Like, I have spent a lot of time thinking about this outside of investigating it, and I'm to that point where I'm trying to rationalize some sort of explanation as to what may have happened to him. And, in my mind, because, again, I have this maybe skewed vision of Allegan, that it's this absolutely crime-free, quiet place, that it couldn't have been something as violent as somebody, committing a violent action against him. I want to think that the most logical explanation is whether he was being chased or just had been intoxicated that night and crashed into the river and accidentally. I feel like that's where my mind takes me most of the time, that there was some accident. Because again, then, if it was this multiple people involved in some sort of heinous crime, that somebody over these last 3 decades would have been able to give us something that would pan out. And because that hasn't happened, it makes you just sort of tend to lean towards some sort of accident. But I just don't know.
And this is where our research ends. There isn't any more avenues to follow. We leave it up to you to help us keep Richie's story alive.
Currently, there is a $15,000 reward for Richie's remains. Richie's cousin Kelly organizes the searches, and just recently they had completed yet another one. She also has a very promising search that we hope will bring the family peace in the future.
Without Kelly, who knows where this case may be today. Currently, she advocates for the Michigan missing persons, and she has helped 120 to 150 families. No family deserves not knowing where their loved one is. If you have information, make sure you tell the people that matter, the family and the police. Richie deserves to be found, not just to be talked about in numerous rumored theories. Kelly has helped so many families, and honestly, I hope we can help her too.
Kelly has also been published in a book titled Letters to Our Missing, where she has written her letter to Richie. There is also a Facebook page called Help Us Find Richard Hitchcock, which I highly suggest following so you can stay up to date with the case and what you may be able to do to help.
And here's what Officer Luyk told us we could do to help.
People stop talking about it, that's when the investigation will totally die. People have to keep talking and keep asking questions and keep looking. Because like I've said before, the smallest little detail that somebody's holding on to because they just figure this can't have anything to do with it, those are the things we need people to report. Because a lot of times it's that little detail that, or something they thought, well, 20 other people probably told you this anyway, so I'm not going to be number 21. Thinking it's already out there when it might not be.
We wanted to thank Richie's family and Officer Luyk for speaking with us and allowing us to use their interviews in this podcast.
This is our first local active missing person case we have covered in this in-depth format, and it is something we hope to continue in the future.
If you are interested in learning more and learning with us on how we can help these families bring their loved ones home, please follow our social media links in the show notes.
Thank you for listening, and join us next Tuesday with a new true crime episode, and we'll have a fun episode on Friday. Bye.